Hi everyone, welcome back to Advanced Studio Classroom. We've been learning about the imperial family in Japan, and more specifically the Emperor Hirohito, who served as the longest reigning of the whole Japanese imperial family. An interesting person who lived in a gilded cage, had opportunities to travel, got involved with the sad part of Japanese history during the 1930s and World War II. And at the end of our last program, we were discussing this question of how deeply involved was the emperor in the whole militaristic strategy and policy of Japan. Was he just a puppet who had no power, or was he a real power in this direction that Japan took in conquest, in fighting other countries, and so on? And we're just going to talk about that a little more before we begin with today's lesson. My name is John. Back with me in the studio, the same teachers that have been helping teach this lesson from the beginning, Stephen and Yvonne and Brian. Hi, teachers.
Hi, John.
Now, at the end of our last lesson, on page 60, the middle of the first column there, we see that there's a large body of historians who believe that Hirohito was powerless to prevent Japan's involvement in World War II. Let's just think, first of all, about this term, a large body of historians. Does that mean they're really big people?
Does it mean they were plump or stocky? No, I mean, when you talk about a group of people, say a group of scientists, you could say a body of scientists. So when you're talking about groups, usually of people or even of corporations or companies, you can refer to it as a body.
We can even talk about a body of knowledge. We could say there's a growing body of knowledge about some subject. That means the sum total of all of the knowledge could be called a body. English is an interesting language. We use words in unexpected ways, and this is one example of that. So a large body of historians, which if you put them all together, you probably have maybe 50 or 100 bodies, one for each historian, but we call them all together a body. All right. And now historians, what historians like to do these days is take a look at the accepted histories and question them.
Exactly.
And turn it all upside down and say, no, it wasn't that way, it was this way. And so now a lot of people are saying, a lot of historians are saying, Hirohito may have been innocent or not as involved as other historians thought he was. Perhaps he was powerless to prevent Japan's involvement in World War II. I think traditionally he's been kind of blamed as being one of the main driving forces behind Japanese policy. Now historians are saying maybe he wasn't. Hard to tell. I haven't read the histories. I don't know what the facts are, so I'm not going to try to form an opinion.
Yeah, but certainly in the West, certainly the people involved who were opposing Japan, the Allies, America, Britain, and the Commonwealth, they certainly have held him responsible the whole time. Whereas, as you said, historians these days, they like to take what's accepted, what people have believed for however long, and then question it, and as you said, turn it upside down and say, no, it wasn't that way at all. He was helpless. He was a puppet. He had nothing to do with it. But there are people who say, well, he was the one who surrendered at the end of the war. If he had the power to surrender, then he had the power to start.
You might also ask, how much did he actually know? Because the only information he would have gotten would be what the generals told him, and they may have told him what they wanted him to know. They may have lied to him and misled him. Who knows? And so he may have been responsible, but acting on incorrect information. When you're living in a palace and you're not able to go down to the 7-Eleven and buy a newspaper and see for yourself, it maybe is not so difficult to be misled or misinformed. Perhaps we'll never know the complete answer to these questions. Well, let's go on with today's lesson. We're now looking at the middle of the first column, page 60. We'll read down to the end of the first column. Follow along with us. By 1945, about 2.3 million Japanese soldiers and nearly 1 million civilians were dead. Tokyo had been burned to the ground. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastated. And yet, many in the government still refused to give up. It was then, finally, that Hirohito broke the silence. In a quavering voice, defying all advice to the contrary, and to the great relief of his subjects, he announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. 3 months later, Hirohito renounced his role as living god. A new constitution was written, allowing the monarchy to continue in a secular role in Japan's new democracy. Now, in just a couple of sentences up at the beginning of this passage, this part of our lesson, we can see kind of a snapshot, a very quick glimpse of the consequences of this Japanese militaristic policy. What happened, what had happened by the end of the Second World War, Brian?
2.3 million Japanese soldiers and nearly 1 million civilians were dead because of the conflict.
That is staggering. You know, the number of people who were killed and probably millions of others injured, millions of others lost their homes, their livelihoods. What terrible destruction. Over 3 million people killed because of this war. And Tokyo, the city of Tokyo, the capital, burned to the ground. Wow. And then 2 other cities devastated, and I think we've all seen photos of the aftermath of those nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Terrible, terrible destruction. And yet, were the Japanese prepared to surrender?
There were some generals who were still not prepared to surrender. After Hiroshima, the first nuclear bomb dropped, they were not prepared to surrender. And so the second one was dropped, and each of them killed about 30,000 people outright. And they still were not prepared to surrender. There were some who thought they should keep fighting.
This raises another very interesting issue, which is, were the Americans right in dropping the bombs, the nuclear bombs, on those cities? Because most of the victims were civilian, not military people. Large numbers of innocent civilians were killed, and some people would argue, well, the Americans could have demonstrated the power of their new weapon without actually killing a lot of people. They could have dropped it on a military target and let the Japanese generals see without actually blowing up a city. But that's another argument that continues as time goes on. Well, many in the government still refuse to give up, and finally, it seems, Hirohito made the difference. What happened, Brian?
He broke the silence. He made a public statement.
Okay, and he defied all advice to the contrary. He received advice from people not to do this, but what did he do, Stephen?
He made an announcement to the public that they were surrendering, which would have been the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor, never mind seen him. It was set up on the public address systems all throughout Japan, we talked about a miracle. This would have been a miraculous occasion for most Japanese to actually hear their emperor's voice, and then to hear him saying that they're surrendering and they're not going to be fighting anymore. Well, that would have been the day to remember. That would have been their defining experience.
Very unusual moment. All right. So what he did was he broke the silence. People knew that Japan was in a very difficult, impossible situation. Really, I think everybody knew they couldn't win this war, but nobody was saying so. And finally, he broke the silence. When someone breaks the silence, they begin to talk about something that needs to be talked about, that hasn't been talked about. You think Hirohito was a great orator, Brian? Did he give a real strong speech like Winston Churchill over there in England?
Sounds like he wasn't very well practiced, and his voice was quavering, shaking a little bit.
Right, he was probably very nervous, feeling a little bit weak, perhaps, not confident. His voice was shaking, it was quavering. And he defied the advice of his advisors, but how did the ordinary people feel about it?
They were relieved. They were glad that it was over. They didn't want this to go on anymore.
In a costly, destructive, terrible war, for what? In the end, Japan lost possessions that they had, lost so many people.
They lost possessions that they had before the war.
Right. So the war was not a good thing for Japan. And it says, to the great relief of his subjects. What's the idea of subject in this context, Brian?
The people underneath him, the common people.
Okay. Now, can a politician have subjects, Stephen? For example, does the President of the United States have subjects?
Theoretically, no. But I mean, the subject is the relationship is between a ruler and his subjects. Theoretically, in a democracy, it doesn't work that way.
Okay. Now, here, subject has nothing to do with what you study in school, English, math, and other subjects. This has the sense of being subject to or under someone in authority. And usually we only use this word in connection with monarchies, kings, and rulers. Those who are under a king are called his subjects, okay? So his subjects were greatly relieved that the emperor was finally getting involved and announcing surrender. That was August 15th, 1945. And the changes didn't stop there. What happened shortly after that, Brian?
He renounced his role as a living god. He said, this isn't right. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Hey, I'm not a god. I've let my country get into all kinds of trouble, and this is a mistake for us to view our royal leaders in this way. Let's not do this anymore. All right, so when you renounce something, Stephen?
It means you put it down. You say, I'm not going to be this anymore. I'm no longer a living God. I disown it.
Okay. And Japan began to write a new constitution. Now, did they do this on their own, or did they have some help from some...
They had a lot of help. In fact, all of Japanese society was reorganized by the Americans. And even the decision to renounce his role as a living God, that was a compromise. They said, okay, we'll let you keep your emperor and we'll let you stay, but you renounce your role as a living God. You are no longer this powerful person. You are here as a figurehead to give the Japanese people something to hold on to.
There may have been something about this idea of a living God which led people to do anything for the sake of the emperor, anything for the sake of Japan. And that's perhaps from an American perspective, that's a dangerous thing to do with people, that they would give up blindly, do anything for their leader. Americans don't live that way. They don't blindly do things for their leader. Americans, at least theoretically, want to do what's right. And if their leader isn't doing what's right, they'll change their leader. So the Americans wanted to influence the future development of Japan. They wanted to change Japan's thinking. They wanted to change Japan's culture of leadership so that it would not be as destructive as it had been. So this new constitution allowed the monarchy to continue, as Stephen said, in a secular role in Japan's new democracy. Now, what's the idea there, a secular role, Brian?
It's no longer religious, or no longer has that religious power.
Okay, secular would be the opposite of religious. And so the emperor and those in the royal family no longer would have any religious significance. They would not be considered gods. And so their power would be less. Their influence on people would be less. Yvonne, any comments?
好，我们回到前面26行，讲到这个 civilians， 就是这些平民或者一些老百姓。那我们讲到这两个城市，在第29行、28、29行 ，Hiroshima 就是广岛 ，Nagasaki 就是长崎哦，大家都很清楚。34行 quaver 就是颤抖的。震抖的意思 ，to defy 是公然反抗的意思。到下面呢，36行这句 ，to the great relief of his subject 在这边是指他统治的这个人民，也就是说他的这个决定呢是解救了他的人民。到下面41行 ，to renounce 就是放弃或弃绝的意思。下面44行 ，secular 这边是指世俗的，就是没有神性的，跟之前的这个现人神是完全相反的。
Thank you, Yvonne. We're going to continue to the end of our lesson, but first, let's listen to this.
This is the worst day of my entire life. Japan is devastated by the war. The loss of life is great. I know the best decision would be to surrender, but many in the government refuse to give up. Oh, Nagako, what should I do?
What I think is that you've been playing the part of God too long. Maybe it's time to do something else, like be human.
Oh, I couldn't do that, Nagako. Why, I don't know what it's like to be human.
Maybe it's time to think about retiring. Playing the role of God is a big responsibility. Why don't you try being the human being you are? Just be Hirohito, Emperor of Japan.
I don't know, Nagako. If I'm no longer a god, then people can touch me. I've never been touched by another human being. Even my own doctor has never done that. I might not survive. Just the thought of it is painful.
Oh, I think you will be all right, Hirohito. Just be you. I mean, you look like everyone else, and you act like everyone else, except when you sit on the chrysanthemum throne. You even sound like everyone else. Have you ever thought that maybe you aren't a god?
Me? Not a god? Oh, thank you, Nagako. No one has ever looked me in the face and said that.
It must have been a strange moment, for sure. Well, let's continue now. We're going to read from the top of the middle column through to the end of today's lesson. Follow along. The everyday life of a retired god. Now, the shy emperor took to making ceremonial visits, even painfully attending the occasional factory opening as Japan's post-war economy boomed. In reality, however, Hirohito was never so happy as when he could wear an old sweater and beat-up hat and rummage around his science lab, conducting experiments in marine biology and writing several highly regarded books on his area of expertise, the jellyfish. Hirohito was the last of the great World War II figures to die, succumbing to cancer in 1989. He had lived long enough to see his country move from bitter defeat to economic victory, and he had managed to save the imperial family in a time of massive global change. Upon his death, his oldest son, Akihito, then 55, assumed the throne. And we learned in our previous lesson that Akihito is the current emperor. He is still on the throne and doing well as far as I know. Well, the everyday life of a retired god. It sounds a little bit ironic to me. It sounds as if the author's poking a little bit of fun at the Emperor Hirohito. What do you think, Brian?
That's right. If you're really a god, how can you retire?
Right. The idea of a human like this being a god is a little hard to accept. So now he's no longer considered God, and he has to go back to living, and what kind of life is he going to live? Well, what are some of the things that he ended up doing after the war, Stephen?
He became very much like the constitutional monarchs in Europe, a ceremonial role, attending openings of hospitals and openings of new companies.
We sometimes call people who are in this kind of role figureheads. They don't have much real political power, but they represent the nation, and they provide a ceremonial presence, a symbol for people to relate to in important occasions. And so where formerly people couldn't even look at him, now he's going and doing things like opening factories. That's really climbing down, I would say. Quite a humbling experience for this guy. He was shy in the first place. He didn't like going out in public. And now he has to attend public events that his forefathers never would have attended. They would never have done anything like this. It says painfully in line 21 there, Brian. What would have been painful about attending a factory opening?
He's probably put on the spot. It's probably a loud, noisy kind of celebration, and he's shy, and he'd probably rather go back to his palace.
He's out there in public view. Everybody's conscious of the history of the previous 15 years and the mistakes the country had made, and probably a lot of people consider him responsible in some way, or responsible for the surrender. So maybe a lot of people really were not happy with him for one reason or another, and here he had to go out in public. But at least Japan's post-war economy was booming, and we know that from World War II on. Japan just grew and grew economically. It's still a mighty power economically today. And so I guess he, in a sense, gave the imperial blessing to this economic development. But Stephen, what did he really like to do?
Well, I mean, it does say that he was shy. I mean, probably here's somebody who all his life has never had to deal with crowds, never had to deal with the public people, never talked to anybody except other kings and queens and courtiers. So his best times is when he's alone, and he says he likes to put on his old clothes and an old sweater and play around in his science lab.
Okay, so he had his own lab. Obviously, he liked to just get on some comfortable clothes, not those kimonos or the special imperial suits or anything. Just get in his lab and rummage around. What does it mean to rummage, Brian?
To reach in and grab things and move things around very quickly and
Poke around, search, look for things, do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Sounds like fun to me. Some people like to rummage around in the kitchen, find something to eat. Other people like to rummage around in the library, find a good book to read.
Or rummage around at a rummage sale.
Yeah, okay. And he did experiments in marine biology. That was his field. Now, I presume he did some study as a younger person. He maybe took courses in university about marine biology of water animals, the life of the sea. And he also wrote some highly regarded books on the subject. So what would that mean if his books were highly regarded?
That means the experts thought they were good books.
Okay, they admired and respected the books that he wrote. And his area of expertise was what, Brian?
jellyfish.
So he was an expert on jellyfish. He had studied jellyfish. He knew a lot about jellyfish. And so when he wrote books about it, people thought, this guy knows what he's talking about. We can learn things from Hirohito's writings. And he lived quite a long time beyond the war, didn't he, Stephen?
Yes, he lived right up until 1989.
And he was the last of the great World War II figures to die. Let's think of some other World War II figures. Brian, can you name one or two great names from World War II?
Eisenhower.
Right? Dwight Eisenhower, the great general and then the President of the United States.
Winston Churchill.
The great leader of Britain.
And Canada and the Dominion.
Also, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Free Chinese during World War II. And there were others as well. All of these people died long before Hirohito did. He was the last to die. How did he die, Stephen?
Cancer.
Okay, it says he succumbed, Brian. What does that mean?
Kind of give in.
Okay, cancer came into his life, invaded his body, and slowly his life ebbed away, and cancer won the fight. Hirohito succumbed. He gave up his life because of the cancer. And he'd seen a lot of changes, hadn't he, Stephen?
Well, I mean, here's somebody who was born into an imperial family when Japan was at the height of its culture, the height of its power in a lot of ways. And by the time his life was over, Japan was economically powerful, but certainly the emperor had no power anymore, and Japan was not what it once was.
Okay, so he'd seen his country grow in power and then suffer this bitter defeat, terrible defeat. I'm sure the Japanese thought that nothing could stop them, but something stopped them. It was a very difficult thing for them to take, defeat. Surrender was humiliating and shameful for them, but they did not waste a lot of time nursing regrets about the past and blaming others. They got busy and developed their economy, and they moved from bitter defeat to economic victory. And especially in the 70s and 80s, Japan was considered perhaps the greatest economy in the world because of the growth, the commitment to excellence, and all of these things. They're having a few problems now, but they're still doing very, very well. What else did he do, Brian?
Well, he was able to save a place for the imperial family, so they still have a place in Japanese society, just not the same amount of power.
Many nations we've seen in history, when their royal family gets the country into trouble, the people decide enough of this. No more royal families. Will become a republic. The United States has done it. France has done it. Russia has done it. Many countries.
Italy has done it.
Germany.
China.
China too, yeah. Republic of China. These are countries that say no more royalty. Royalty is not good. We don't want leaders who are not accountable, who have absolute authority. We want to have government by the people, of the people, for the people. And so this didn't happen in Japan. Japan still has its royal family. Okay? And it has been a time of massive global change, or great global change. He died in 1989, and then Akihito, who was 55 at the time, he assumed the throne. And we know that Akihito's son, whose name does not come to my mind at the moment, he's waiting for his turn. One of these days he will ascend the chrysanthemum throne and become the Emperor of Japan, but no longer a living god. Yvonne, any comments?
好，回到中间这个 column 24行 to boom 就是蓬勃发展的意思，下面28行 rummage 就是翻找，然后31行 marine biology 就是海洋生物学，到第3个 column 21行 to succumb 就是死鱼的意思。
Thank you, Yvonne. Now notice that this article is to be continued. It will continue next month with more information about Japan yesterday and today. I'd just like to take another look at that word succumb that we see on line 21. Brian, if someone dies in a car accident, would we say that they succumbed to the car accident?
No, because that's usually a very, very quick and fatal. Succumb is a slow process.
Right, okay, so a sudden death would not be succumbing. Do people only succumb when they die? I mean, is that the only way to succumb, Stephen?
Well, to succumb is to be overpowered by something. So if you're a wrestler and you're fighting with somebody else and the stronger person wins, then you have succumbed to the stronger person.
We could say that in World War II, Japan succumbed to the Allied forces led by the Americans in the Pacific, and they had to surrender. They succumbed to a superior force. Okay? So that's an interesting word. Yvonne, any other words you think we could take a second look at here?
I think we can go back to the first column, line 41, the verb to renounce.
All right, and Stephen, what does that mean again?
Renounce means to give up.
All right.
If you renounce the throne, you give up the throne. If you renounce your claim to your fortune, then you give up your claim to your fortune.
All right. What about denounce? Change one letter, change the R to a D. We have the word denounce. It's a different meaning, right?
Yeah, it means to speak against something, to call something bad.
All right. So if somebody stands up in public and says that a certain leader is a bad person, they've been doing bad things, that would be to denounce that person, to speak against them. Renounce, denounce, related but not exactly the same. Well, students, we hope you've enjoyed studying with us. As I said, this article will continue next month, and we'll perhaps learn more about Japan, the country, rather than the ruling family of Japan. Be sure to join us then. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.